Hi, I'm Rich Smith. Thanks for sticking around for the last bit of the agriculture session here. How many farmers are in the room? Just so I know my audience. Okay, a couple. All right, good. How many folks know what cover crops are, or have heard the term? Okay, excellent. So I won't give too much explanation about cover crops. And this is a story about cover crops, really. So you may or may not be aware that there's a lot of interest right now in using cover crops, and specifically in using cover crop mixtures of different cover crops grown together, and these are sometimes called cover crop cocktails. Here's just some screen grabs from the popular press out there, and the idea is that you can grow cover crops as mixtures, and that you should realize some additional benefits of having these mixtures of cover crops as opposed to just planting a single cover crop species, which is kind of the more traditional practice. And I should say that some of these cover crop mixtures can contain as many as 15 to 18 different species in one go. So there's a lot of different reasons for using cover crop mixtures. Notill Farmer recently had a survey of folks that were using mixtures. They got 100 respondents. They wanted to know why they were using mixtures rather than monocultures of cover crops. And for 15 of the respondents, they had some more detailed kind of profiles. And so some of the stated goals from these farmers were things like capture of nutrients and prevention of erosion, feeding the soil biology, feeding earthworms came up a lot, improving soil structure and organic matter. So a lot of kind of soil health, soil quality type goals. Diversification of rooting structure came up a lot. Also nitrogen fixation. So if we're dealing with legume cover crops, so basically a biological source of nitrogen. Some folks mentioned alternative forage because you can graze these cover crops as well. But only one of the respondents mentioned weed suppression as a goal, which as a weed ecologist, I was actually kind of shocked. Because I think of cover crops for these reasons, but I also think about them in terms of how we could use them for suppressing weeds without having to use herbicides. And so there's a lot of reasons why we might expect that a mixture of cover crops should be more beneficial to the soil than having just a monoculture. And you've actually seen this figure before in this section, but you can imagine that having a diversity of different types of species that have different types of root architecture that exude different types and qualities of organic compounds into the soil should have, we would think, maybe beneficial effects on the soil. And not to mention the fact that these different root architectures should be able to explore different parts of the soil profile. So we might think that overall the productivity of that cover crop community should be perhaps better than if you just had a single species growing as a cover crop. There's also a whole host and body of ecological theory and data that suggests that when you have multiple species growing together, that things like total productivity and biomass should increase, and that the amount of unused resources should decrease. Again, because if you have more species, they should be able to acquire more of the available resources in the soil, such as nitrogen. So there's a lot of reasons to think that cover crop mixtures should be a really useful thing. But the question is, are they? Is it better to have more than just using a monoculture? So we know that farmers are interested in cover crop mixtures or cocktails. Mainly it seems to improve soil quality or health. Weed suppression is often not the primary goal for using these, but there's really little scientific evidence to support the use of cover crop mixtures, surprisingly, and that's mainly just due to a lack of research on these mixtures. And then we also know that there's theoretical and empirical and data out there to support that there's this relationship between the amount of plant diversity and certain functions like productivity and the use of soil resources, which should suggest that the amount of cover crops that you can grow should be higher with a mixture compared to a monoculture, and that using mixtures of cover crops should be more weed suppressive than having monocultures of cover crops. But a lot of this data and theory hasn't come out of experimentation with cover crops. So today I want to present some data that answer these questions. Pretty simple questions. Do cover crop mixtures produce more crop biomass than cover crop monocultures? Do they suppress weeds better than monocultures? And do we actually get benefits to the soil that result in enhancement of a subsequent crop that we might grow after growing these mixtures? So these data come from an experiment that we've conducted out at, in Durham at our Kingman research farm. We basically looked at 3 groups of crop species. So you can see the 3 different groups here. They're all targeting different planting times. And this was actually an alternative forage crop study. But a lot of these, these are, we can use these as cover crops as well, so we can consider it a cover crop study. So that's when they were planted. And the target was to maximize biomass at different times in the year. So you can see this one's trying to maximize the amount of summer biomass, fall biomass, and spring biomass there. But for all intents and purposes, we can think of this as 3 separate experiments. And I'm going to call them experiment 1 through 3 from here on out. So for each experiment, we planted each of the species as monocultures. We planted them in 3-way mixtures where we reduced the seeding rate by 1/6. So each had 1/6 the seeding rate, trying to keep the seeding rate constant. We had a 14-way mixture that included all of the species. And then we had a control where we just didn't plant anything, didn't plant any cover crop. You can see in experiment 3, we're only dealing with 5 species, so we have a 5-way mixture there. So that's the experimental design. This is the growth period that we were targeting. At the end of that period, we measured the total cover crop biomass as well as the biomass of weeds that were present. And you can see that in experiment 3, the cover crops overwinter, and then we're measuring in the subsequent spring here. Then we tilled the cover crops under to incorporate the residues. And then soon after, we planted what we call a phytometer. This is basically our cash crop or our test crop. And you can see that for each of the phytometers, it was a mixture of 2 crops. Here is canola and wheat, buckwheat and millet, and forage radish and oats. And the idea with those was to be planting something that hadn't been present in the cover crop that preceded it and that was appropriate for the time period that we were looking at. And at the end of a period of growth, we measured the phytometer biomass and the weed biomass. All right, so on to answer each of these questions. Do mixtures produce more than monocultures? Here's the crop production, the biomass production for each of the monocultures. You can see that chickling vetch had the lowest, buckwheat had the highest, and we had some range there. And then our 2 mixtures fell out here. So not too bad in terms of production. The 6-way mixture actually was just as productive as our 3 most productive monocultures, but certainly not any more productive, right? Same story for experiment 2. Sun hemp was our lowest producing species in monoculture. Wheat, oats, and triticale had the highest production. And again, decent production in our 2 mixtures, but nothing higher or better than our best producing species in monoculture. And for experiment 3, actually here, while the 5-way mixture produced as well as some of our most productive monocultures, the 14-way actually didn't produce any better than some of our lowest producers. So we're really not seeing any added benefits of these mixtures, at least in terms of biomass production. Of course, expecting these mixtures to produce more than the most productive. Monocultures might be somewhat unrealistic. So we calculated what's known as the land equivalent ratio, and I won't go into it other than to say if the land equivalent ratio is 1, we are basically producing as much biomass in a mixture as we would expect given how well the monocultures, individual monocultures produced. Anything above that means that we're actually getting some benefit above what we would expect given what the monocultures are yielding. And so for each of the 3 experiments, you can see that our 6-way or 5-way mixtures actually come out higher than 1. So there is something going on in those mixtures where there's some beneficial synergies happening. Not so much in our 14-way mixtures, but something's going on in those 6-way mixtures. So certainly they should be more suppressive of weeds then. And again, basically same type of graph. Here we're also showing that weedy fallow. You can see weeds were pretty high. Some of these monocultures really did suppress weeds well, especially buckwheat and oats. And here's our mixtures. Weed suppressive, but not any better than buckwheat or oats were, for sure. Same with experiment 2. Our most suppressive monoculture was forage radish. We've seen this quite a bit in our research. And again, very suppressive in the mixtures, but not any more suppressive than forage radish in monoculture. And here, for experiment 3, they were all relatively weed suppressive, and again, but no better in those mixtures. So really no evidence for enhanced weed suppression with the mixtures. Lastly, all right, do we see some evidence of improved soil quality or benefits to a subsequent crop? Here we're looking at experiment 1 where our test crop is canola and wheat, and you can see that the highest biomass of canola and wheat, the highest productivity of those species was when they followed buckwheat. And really, you know, we don't see any evidence of benefit here. None of the mixtures were any better than buckwheat. Similar here, the best monoculture was forage radish, so buckwheat and millet, when grown after forage radish, produced the most biomass, and only the 14-way mixture was comparable to that. The 6-way was actually less. So again, no enhancements that we can detect. And in fact, in experiment 3, Harry Vetch produced the highest forage radish and oats biomass, and that was much higher than what we saw when those 2 species were planted after our mixtures. So just to summarize, if you're thinking about planting mixtures, you might be better off just planting the best cover crop for whatever your goal is, right? We found no evidence that mixtures were more productive than the most productive cover crop grown in monoculture. No evidence that mixtures suppressed weeds better than the most suppressive crop grown in monoculture. No evidence that mixtures improved the soil, that improved the growth of a subsequent crop biculture better than the most effective crop grown in monoculture. We also saw, you know, not a whole lot of evidence that you suffer by using mixtures. And it may be the case that mixtures are kind of a good bet hedging strategy, especially with the way the weather is these days. You really never know what type of season we're going to have, and so having a mixture of cover crop species might kind of protect you from some of that weather variability. And it's very possible that mixtures have other benefits that we did not measure in this relatively small and simple study, and certainly there's more work that is needed. But at least based on our data, again, you might be better off just growing monocultures of the best cover crop for the job. So just some acknowledgments and funding, and if I have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Take 1 or 2 quick questions, and maybe get Patty up here. We can start doing a quick changeover to the forestry section.
From an economic standpoint, probably better to go with a monoculture than a mixed culture, depending upon what those seeds cost, or?
Yeah, that's something we haven't done is the economics. So that's kind of the next step. You know, we did reduce the seeding rates, you know, by 1/6 in the 6 ways for that purpose to hopefully keep some of the economics comparable. You can buy mixtures these days, different types of, they're also called blends sometimes, and so you know, you don't have to actually go out and buy these species individually necessarily, so that might help with some of the economics, but we don't have any economic data. Yep. Okay.
When you're talking about biomass, that was strictly above ground, right?
Yep. Yep, that above ground biomass. So what's happening under the soil root-wise, we don't know. Yeah.
Were you using the biomass? Was it forage, or was it harvested, or was it put under? What did you do?
It was put under. In this case, it was tilled under. We could have all of it. We could have, you know, grazed cattle or some other animal in there and used it as forage as well. You know, so that's another use of these crops.
So the mix, you know, not knowing what your weather conditions are going to be, and had you picked the wrong one, you would have been way ahead of the game.
Exactly.
You had to pick the right one for your cover crop in order to match what the mix did.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like I said, it might be a good bet hedging strategy because we didn't see a whole lot of evidence that you take a hit,
Right.
Except in a couple cases. Though I would say that buckwheat and forage radish consistently in our research that we've been doing for a number of years now always seem to come out on top for a number of different variables.
Just comment on that forage radish.
Forage radish is, it's also known as daikon radish, so it's also known as tillage radish, so it produces a really long taproot. So a lot of folks like it for its ability to break up soil compaction. We think one of the reasons it has such a large impact on subsequent crops is that it's actually pulling nitrogen from deep in the soil and making it available that would otherwise it wouldn't be available. It winter kills, so you usually plant it in, say, like August, and it winter kills, and so you don't have to worry about it when you're coming in the next season. You don't have to figure out a way to terminate it. So it's a pretty neat cover crop that a lot of folks are pretty interested in.